Imagine a cold evening when a mother, desperate, tears streaming down her face, enters a taxi with nothing but a heavy heart and a handful of change. She's just been through a whirlwind of challenges, and the last thing she expected was a moment of kindness. But sometimes the universe has a way of showing us that there's still hope in the world, especially when you least expect it. What happens next will remind you of the power of human kindness. Stay tuned, because this story will leave you speechless. Hello guys, welcome to Stories of Hope. Today, I'm really excited to share a new story with you that will leave you both amazed and touched. It's a story about an unexpected act of kindness that takes place on the streets of a busy city, one that transforms the lives of two people forever. Before we dive into the story though, let me know where you're watching this video from. Tell me the name of your city or country in the comments. I'd love to hear from all of you. Now, let's get into this heartwarming tale of kindness and how one taxi driver's refusal to accept payment from an upset mother leads to something unimaginable. The sky above the city was streaked with the colors of dusk as the streets hummed with the usual chaos. The headlights of taxis and cars reflected off the rain-soaked pavement, casting an almost surreal glow on the scene. In the middle of it all, a woman stood by the curb, clutching her coat tightly against the chill of the evening. Her eyes were red, her cheeks streaked with the remnants of tears. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her name was Sarah, and she had just received news that would shatter her world. Her son, Tommy, had been in a car accident earlier that morning. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious enough that he needed medical attention. Sarah had rushed to the hospital with nothing but a prayer in her heart and a desperate hope that her son would be okay. But when she arrived, she was greeted with a harsh reality. The hospital bills were piling up and she simply didn't have the money. She wasn't even sure how she would get home. Her last few dollars had been spent on the emergency room fees. Standing there in the middle of the busy street, Sarah felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. She had tried calling a few of her friends for help, but there was no answer. There was no one left to turn to. With a heavy heart, Sarah hailed the nearest taxi. She wasn't sure how she was going to make it through the night, but she knew she needed to get home. As the taxi pulled up, she wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, greeted her with a warm smile, though he could see the exhaustion in her face. "Where to, miss?" he asked, his voice gentle. Just take me home, please," Sarah muttered, too tired to explain the full story. She climbed into the back seat and closed her eyes, her hands trembling as she gripped her purse. As the taxi slowly made its way through the city, Sarah's mind raced. Her son needed her, but she couldn't even afford the fare to get home. What was she supposed to do? How could she keep going when it felt like the weight of the world was on her shoulders? The taxi driver, Mr. Jacobs, glanced at her through the rearview mirror. He had been driving for over 30 years, but something about this woman struck him deeply. He could tell she wasn't just tired, she was broken, the kind of broken that only comes from a mother who would do anything for her child, yet felt powerless to make it happen. As they approached Sarah's neighborhood, he couldn't help but notice her hands shaking. He knew she was struggling, and though he wasn't sure what had happened, he had a feeling it was something serious. The ride was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional honk of a horn from the bustling streets outside. When they finally reached her destination, Sarah fumbled for her wallet, but her hands trembled so much that she could barely open it. The weight of the world seemed to rest on her shoulders. As she finally pulled out the last of her crumpled bills, Mr. Jacobs turned to her, his voice low and steady. "You don't need to pay," he said, his words gentle but firm. Sarah looked at him in disbelief. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "I mean, "I'm not going to take your money," he replied, his gaze softening. "I've seen enough pain in my life to know when someone needs help, even if they don't ask for it. You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she struggled to find the right words. She had never expected this. A stranger, someone who had no reason to help her, was offering her something she had never asked for: kindness. "You don't understand," Sarah whispered, choking back her sobs. "I don't know what to do anymore. I can't take care of my son the way he needs. I can't even pay for the things he needs to get better. I'm failing him." Mr. Jacobs didn't say a word, but his eyes spoke volumes. He knew what it felt like to struggle, to fight for something you loved, and to feel like there was no way out. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled tissue, handing it to Sarah with a quiet nod. "You're not failing him," he said softly. "You're doing the best you can. And right now, that's all that matters." Sarah took the tissue, tears streaming down her face as she wiped her eyes. She had never felt so vulnerable in her life. Yet, in this moment, a simple act of kindness made her feel seen, understood, and not so alone. As she stepped out of the taxi, Sarah looked at Mr. Jacobs, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, offering her a kind smile. "Take care of yourself and your son. You've got this." With that, Sarah walked up to her apartment, her heart a little lighter, her mind a little clearer. She still didn't know how everything would turn out. But in that one moment, Sarah had learned that kindness could make all the difference in the world. And as for Mr. Jacobs, he drove away into the night, knowing that he had done something that mattered, something that would stay with him forever. The next morning, Sarah woke up to the harsh sound of her alarm clock blaring. The sun barely peeked through the blinds, casting a faint golden glow over her apartment. She had hardly slept the night before, the weight of her son's condition pressing heavily on her chest. She could still feel the sting of helplessness, the crushing realization that she didn't have enough to give Tommy the care he deserved. But she had to move. She had to keep going, for Tommy. She wiped the remnants of sleep from her eyes, gathered what little strength she had left, and stood up to face another day. The clock ticked, but her mind raced with thoughts of what she could do. How could she make things right for Tommy? How could she fix everything? As Sarah prepared breakfast, the phone in her kitchen rang. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw it was the hospital. She hesitated before answering, dreading the worst. Could the bills be even worse than she thought? "Hello?" Sarah's voice trembled as she spoke. "Hi, is this Mrs. Sarah Williams?" a calm voice asked from the other end. "Yes, this is Sarah," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is Dr. Parker from the hospital. I just wanted to check in on your son, Tommy. He's doing a lot better today. We've got him on a treatment plan and he's recovering well. But I did want to go over some things with you." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had expected bad news, but hearing the doctor's soothing words brought a flood of relief. "He's okay?" she asked, almost unable to believe it. "Yes, he's going to be fine," Dr. Parker reassured her. "But there's something I need to tell you. We've been able to work out a payment plan for Tommy's treatment. I understand things are tough, and we want to make sure you're not overwhelmed." A wave of gratitude washed over Sarah, and for the first time in days, she felt a small glimmer of hope. She thanked the doctor, her voice trembling with emotion, before hanging up. But even as she felt relief, something still gnawed at her. How could she have been so close to giving up on herself when all along help had been within reach? The next few days passed in a blur. Sarah's focus was entirely on Tommy's recovery. She visited him at the hospital every day, bringing him his favorite snacks and books, trying to make his hospital room feel like home. Even though she still didn't have all the answers, she knew that Tommy needed her to stay strong. Her love for him was unwavering, and it was all she had left. One afternoon, when Sarah had just returned from the hospital, she heard a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, and she hesitated before opening it. When she did, her eyes widened in surprise. Standing at her door was Mr. Jacobs, the taxi driver who had given her that kindness just a few nights ago. He was holding a small, weathered envelope in his hands. Sarah blinked, confused. "Mr. Jacobs, what are you doing here?" she asked, still processing the sight of him standing on her doorstep. "I know it's not much," he said, his voice steady but kind, "but I wanted to help in whatever way I could." He handed Sarah the envelope, and as she opened it, her eyes widened with disbelief. Inside was a check for a significant amount of money, more than she had ever seen in one place. The sum was enough to cover the hospital fees, and then some. It was a gesture that left Sarah speechless. "Why?" was all she could manage to say. Mr. Jacobs gave her a soft smile. "Because you're not alone, Sarah, and I know what it's like to feel like you don't have a way out. I've been there too. The world can be a harsh place, but there are still good people willing to help. I just wanted to remind you of that." Sarah stood there, the check in her hand, her heart racing. She had been so consumed with worry that she hadn't even considered the possibility of someone reaching out to help her again. It was one thing to be given kindness in the midst of despair, but to receive such a generous act from a stranger, it was almost too much to process. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she struggled to speak. "I don't know how to thank you. You've given me hope when I thought it was all gone." Mr. Jacobs simply nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just remember that no matter how tough it gets, there's always hope. And when you get through this, you can pay it forward. The world needs more people willing to help." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing at her door, her heart full of gratitude. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the check in her hands, still unable to fully comprehend the depth of what had just happened. The more Sarah thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about the money. It wasn't just about the bills being paid or the relief she felt. It was about something much deeper, a reminder that there was still good in the world, that there were people who cared even when things seemed impossible. And in that moment, Sarah made a vow to herself. She would never forget this kindness. She would never forget the taxi driver who saw a woman struggling and chose to do something about it. She would find a way to pay it forward, to help others the way she had been helped. Her son Tommy was going to be okay. And with the support of people like Mr. Jacobs, Sarah knew that she could face whatever challenges came next. As the days passed, Sarah's life began to settle into a new rhythm. Tommy was recovering, his laughter filling the house once again, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah allowed herself to believe that everything might actually be okay. The weight of the bills, the medical complications, and the feeling of being overwhelmed slowly began to lift, replaced by a growing sense of gratitude and optimism. However, despite the relief she had experienced, Sarah couldn't shake the deep sense of unease that lingered within her. Mr. Jacobs' act of kindness had left a lasting impression, one that made Sarah reflect not just on her situation, but on the kindness of strangers. How could one person change the course of her entire week? How could a gesture so simple, yet so profound, make her feel like she wasn't invisible in a world that often felt indifferent? Sarah found herself thinking about Mr. Jacobs constantly. She hadn't asked him for help that night, and yet he had given it. And not just a small token of kindness, but something that had made all the difference. She had been so focused on her own struggles that she had never once considered the possibility of someone else stepping in to ease the burden, She needed to do something. She couldn't just accept this generosity and move on with her life. She had to find a way to honor it. But how? What could she possibly do to repay him for what he had done? No amount of money or gifts could truly express the gratitude she felt. As the thought lingered in her mind, Sarah decided that she would visit Mr. Jacobs. She would find a way to thank him, to look him in the eye and tell him how much he had changed her life. She didn't know what to expect, but she couldn't just let this moment pass without showing him how much his kindness had meant to her. The next morning, after dropping Tommy off at school, Sarah set out. She had no idea where Mr. Jacobs lived, but she remembered him mentioning something about a small apartment on the outskirts of town. She drove through the busy streets, her mind racing with anticipation and doubt. What would she say? How could she possibly convey the depth of her gratitude? After a while, Sarah found herself in front of a small, run-down apartment building. The paint on the walls was chipped and the windows were cracked. It wasn't much, but it was home to someone who had made a difference in her life. She parked the car, took a deep breath, and made her way inside. The building smelled of old wood and dust, a quiet reminder of the lives that had passed through its halls. Sarah walked up the narrow staircase to the second floor, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached the door, she hesitated. What if she was intruding? What if Mr. Jacobs didn't want to be found? She knocked softly, and after a few moments the door creaked open. Standing there was Mr. Jacobs, his expression warm yet surprised to see her. He looked different up close, older perhaps, with a few more lines on his face than she remembered. But his eyes still held the same kindness, the same quiet strength. "Mrs. Williams?" he asked, his voice gentle. "What brings you here?" I wanted to thank you," Sarah said, her voice catching in her throat, "for everything, for what you did. You don't know how much it means to me." Mr. Jacobs gave her a small, humble smile and motioned for her to come inside. "Please, come in." The apartment was modest but cozy. There were old photographs on the walls, reminders of a life well lived, and a small kitchen where the scent of fresh coffee lingered. They sat down at the worn table, and Sarah felt a warmth spread through her as they talked. She explained how Tommy was doing better, how the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders, and how she had no idea how to repay him for what he had done. Mr. Jacobs listened quietly, nodding along as she spoke. "I didn't do it for a thank you," he said simply. "I just saw someone who needed help, and I acted. It's not always easy to ask for help when you're struggling, but sometimes you don't have to ask. Sometimes there's someone who sees you, even when you feel invisible." Sarah's chest tightened as she listened to his words. It was as though he had read her thoughts. He wasn't just talking about her, but about the world in general. How many people felt invisible every day? How many people were too proud to ask for help, too ashamed to admit they needed it? And how many of them suffered in silence, never knowing that someone might reach out to them, just as Mr. Jacobs had reached out to her? "I don't know what I would have done without you," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You saved me, Mr. Jacobs. You really did." He shook his head slowly. "I didn't save you, Sarah. You saved yourself. You just needed someone to remind you of your worth. You've always had the strength inside you. You just needed to be reminded." The words hit her like a wave, and for a long moment, Sarah was silent. She had been so focused on her struggles that she had forgotten about her own resilience. She had forgotten that she, too, had the strength to overcome the obstacles in her life. Mr. Jacobs hadn't just helped her financially, he had helped her rediscover herself. "Thank you," Sarah whispered again, this time with more conviction. "Thank you for reminding me." Mr. Jacobs nodded and stood up. "It's all right, Sarah. But now, It's your turn to pay it forward. You've got that strength. Don't forget it." As Sarah left his apartment, she felt lighter than she had in days. She had come to thank him, but in the end, it was he who had given her something far more valuable. He had given her the belief that she could overcome anything, that she was capable of more than she had realized. And that belief would stay with her for the rest of her life. The weeks that followed Mr. Jacobs' unexpected visit transformed Sarah. She had always considered herself a survivor, but after that day, she finally understood what that really meant. The weight of her worries had shifted from her shoulders, and in their place, a sense of purpose and clarity took root. She didn't just want to survive anymore. She wanted to live, to fight for the life she had always dreamed of for her son, and to give back the kindness she had received. Tommy's recovery continued to improve day by day. He was back to his energetic self, running around the house with a big smile on his face. The doctors were impressed with his progress, and Sarah couldn't have been more grateful for the miracle she had witnessed in her son. But despite everything going well, she knew that things couldn't return to normal. The world had changed for her. She had changed. The experience with Mr. Jacobs had opened her eyes in ways she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about the physical relief, the check that had paid off the hospital bills. It was about something much deeper. The kindness of a stranger had sparked something within her, something that was now driving her to make a difference. She wasn't going to let this moment fade into the background. She was going to honor it in every way she could. One afternoon, as Sarah was cleaning the house, her phone rang. It was Tommy's school. Her stomach dropped as she answered, but the voice on the other end was calm. "Mrs. Williams, I just wanted to let you know that Tommy has been doing really well at school. He's made significant progress, and we're impressed with his determination. We'd like to invite you both to a small ceremony next week to recognize his achievements." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she heard the words. Tommy was doing well. He was thriving, and it felt like a dream. She could almost hear his joyful laugh echoing in her head as she pictured him standing proudly on that stage, accepting recognition for his resilience. It wasn't just a victory for Tommy, it was a victory for them both. The ceremony arrived, and as Sarah watched Tommy walk across the stage to accept his award, she couldn't contain her emotions. The child who had once been so fragile, so sick, was now standing tall, beaming with pride. The crowd cheered, and in that moment, Sarah felt a surge of love and pride that filled her heart to the brim. She had fought for him, and together they had won. After the ceremony, Tommy ran up to her, his eyes sparkling. "Mom, did you see? I did it!" he exclaimed, hugging her tightly. Sarah smiled through her tears, holding him close. "I saw, baby. I saw. I'm so proud of you." As they left the school, a familiar face appeared in the crowd. It was Mr. Jacobs. He had driven all the way to the ceremony just to see Tommy's success. As Sarah spotted him, she couldn't help but feel overwhelmed with emotion. This man, who had helped her when she had nowhere else to turn, was now here, witnessing the fruits of his kindness. "I couldn't miss it," Mr. Jacobs said with a grin, his eyes shining with pride. "I told you, Sarah, you've got that strength. Now look at you." Sarah walked toward him, unable to hold back the tears. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "You've been there for me when I didn't even realize I needed someone. You gave me hope when I thought I had nothing left. And now, look at us. Tommy's doing great, and I'm doing great. We're going to be okay." Mr. Jacobs smiled softly, his eyes filled with a quiet wisdom. "You did it, Sarah. You just needed a little reminder. And now you're helping Tommy become the young man he's meant to be. That's all the thanks I need." For a moment, they stood there in the middle of the bustling crowd, a silent understanding passing between them. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the check or the hospital bills. It was about something far more important, the kind of people they had become because of each other. Mr. Jacobs had reminded Sarah of the power of kindness, and in return, she was reminding him of the strength within himself to continue helping others. As the evening wore on, Sarah and Tommy went home, the weight of their past struggles finally starting to lift. They had built a new future together, one that was filled with hope, resilience, and possibility. Sarah knew that life would always have its challenges, but she also knew that she was no longer facing them alone. She had learned from Mr. Jacobs that even the smallest act of kindness could have a ripple effect that changed the entire course of someone's life. And now, she was determined to be that person for someone else. Months passed, and Sarah's life continued to evolve in ways she never could have anticipated. The lessons she had learned from Mr. Jacobs, the importance of kindness, the strength within herself, and the power of helping others, began to shape her into a different person. No longer was she just surviving, she was living, making choices that reflected her newfound belief that kindness had the power to change everything. She found herself looking for opportunities to pay it forward, to help those who were struggling in ways that only she could understand. It wasn't always easy. Life still had its challenges, and the weight of responsibility never fully lifted from her shoulders. But Sarah knew that the more she gave, the more she received in return. It was a simple but profound truth that had become her guiding force. One day, as she was grocery shopping with Tommy, she saw a woman standing by the entrance of the store. She was holding a small child in her arms, looking down at a list of items, but her face was clouded with worry. Sarah noticed the woman's worn clothes, the tired look in her eyes, and the uncertainty in her stance. It was a look Sarah knew all too well, a look of someone who was struggling, but too proud to ask for help. The moment Sarah saw her, a voice inside her stirred. It was the same feeling she had when Mr. Jacobs had helped her. She couldn't just walk past this woman and do nothing. She knew what it felt like to be invisible, to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders and have no one see. This woman needed help, and Sarah had the strength to give it. She walked up to the woman, her heart beating faster with a mixture of nervousness and determination. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice soft but clear. The woman looked up, startled at first, as if she hadn't expected anyone to approach her. "I just wanted to let you know that if you need anything, I'd be happy to help." The woman's eyes widened in surprise, and then she glanced down at her child, her expression shifting to one of hesitation. I don't want to impose," she said quietly, her voice breaking. Sarah smiled kindly. "You're not imposing. I understand more than you know. I've been there too. Let me help with your groceries or whatever you need." The woman hesitated for a moment, then nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what to say." "It's all right," Sarah replied, her voice steady and warm. "You don't have to say anything. I'm just here to help." As Sarah helped the woman gather her groceries, she realized that this moment was more than just a simple act of kindness. It was a continuation of the cycle that had started with Mr. Jacobs. She was now the one offering a hand, the one showing someone else that they weren't invisible, that their struggles mattered. And in doing so, she was reminded once again of the power of human connection, the way a single moment of compassion could change the course of someone's day, or even their life. When they reached the checkout counter, Sarah paid for the woman's groceries just as Mr. Jacobs had done for her. The woman's eyes filled with gratitude as she looked at Sarah. "You don't know how much this means to me," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been struggling so much, and I didn't know where to turn. You've given me hope." Tears stung Sarah's eyes as she smiled. "I'm just paying it forward," she said. You've got this. You're stronger than you know." As the woman left the store, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. She had helped someone else, but more than that, she had become part of the cycle that had started when Mr. Jacobs had reached out to her. The kindness that had been given to her was now being passed along, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. That evening, as Sarah sat with Tommy, reflecting on the events of the day, she couldn't help but smile. She had done more than just help a stranger. She had created a ripple effect. She had become the person who made a difference, the person who saw others when they felt invisible. And in doing so, she had reminded herself of the power within her to change not just her own life, but the lives of those around her. Mr. Jacobs had taught her a lesson she would never forget, that sometimes the simplest acts of kindness could have the most profound impact. And now, Sarah was passing that lesson on, creating a legacy of compassion that would continue to grow, one act of kindness at a time. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Sarah found herself not only helping others, but being helped in ways she never expected. She discovered that the more she gave, the more her life seemed to fall into place. She found new opportunities, new friendships, and a deeper sense of peace that came from knowing that she was living her truth, that she was making the world a better place, one small act of kindness at a time. And as for Mr. Jacobs, well, Sarah never forgot him. She continued to visit him from time to time to let him know how much his kindness had changed her life. But she also made sure to tell him that his legacy was alive, that he had passed the torch, and now it was her turn to carry it. It was a year later when Sarah found herself standing in front of a crowd giving a speech at a charity event she had organized. The event was dedicated to helping families in need, inspired by the very kindness that had changed her life. She had come full circle from a woman struggling to make ends meet to someone who was now able to give back in ways she had never imagined. In front of her, a sea of faces looked up at her, some hopeful, some uncertain, but all eager to hear what she had to say. As she stepped up to the podium, she took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She thought back to the moment when she had first met Mr. Jacobs, when the world had seemed impossibly heavy and she was drowning in despair. How much had changed since then? How much had she grown, and how much had the world changed because of the small acts of kindness that had rippled through her life? "Good evening, everyone," Sarah began, her voice steady yet filled with emotion. "A year ago, I was where so many of you are today, struggling, unsure if things would ever get better. But someone reached out to me when I needed it most. A stranger who saw me, who saw the pain in my eyes and decided to help. And that kindness changed everything. It gave me the strength to keep going, to believe that a better life was possible." She paused, letting the words sink in. The room was silent, the weight of her story hanging in the air. "I'm here today, not just because I've made it through," she continued, "but because I want to help others make it through too. I want to be the person who lifts someone up when they feel like they can't stand. I want to be the person who makes a difference in someone's life, just like Mr. Jacobs did for me. Because kindness isn't just a gesture, it's a lifeline. It's the thing that connects us all, the thing that reminds us we're not alone, no matter how dark the road may seem." The crowd was still, hanging on to every word. Sarah's eyes scanned the room, seeing people who had faces full of hope, some with tears in their eyes, others nodding in understanding. She knew these were the people who needed to hear her story, who needed to know that no matter how hard life got, there was always room for kindness, and that it could change everything. She paused again, her thoughts turning to Tommy. He was sitting in the front row, his hand resting gently in hers, a proud smile on his face. He had grown so much over the past year, and every day Sarah saw in him the lessons she had taught him. That no matter how tough things got, you could always find a way to rise above. That no matter how little you had, you could always give something. "Tommy," she said softly, her voice breaking as she looked at her son. "You're my greatest blessing, and everything I do is for you. You've shown me what true strength is, and I couldn't be prouder of the young man you're becoming. I want you to remember something, always. When you see someone in need, when you see someone struggling, don't look away. Help them, because one act of kindness can change everything." The room erupted into applause, and Sarah felt her heart swell with pride. It wasn't for her. It was for every person in that room, for every person who had felt alone, for every person who had ever needed a hand to hold. It was for the children, like Tommy, who would carry on the lessons of compassion and hope. After the event, Sarah stayed behind to speak with a few of the families who had attended. As she walked through the crowd, offering words of encouragement and support, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. There was a time when she had been lost, when she had felt like she was fighting an impossible battle. But now, she was surrounded by people who had become her community, her support system. They were all part of the same story, each of them playing a part in creating a better world. When Sarah returned home that evening, she found Tommy sitting at the kitchen table, drawing in his notebook. His face lit up when he saw her. "Mom, you were amazing," he exclaimed, running to give her a hug. Sarah smiled, wrapping her arms around him tightly. "Thank you, sweetheart. But today wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. It's about what we can do together. And I'll always be here, ready to give whatever I have to help others, just like Mr. Jacobs helped me." Tommy looked up at her, his eyes full of admiration. "I want to help people too, Mom, just like you." Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she looked down at her son. "And you will, Tommy. You will." As they sat together that night, the warmth of their home surrounding them, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. She had found her purpose, and she was living it every day. She was no longer just a mother trying to survive. She was a woman who had been changed by kindness, who had turned her pain into purpose, and who was now passing it on to the next generation. In the end, it wasn't about the money or the material things. It was about the people we touch and the lives we change. And Sarah knew that the ripple effect of kindness would continue long after her story was told. As we come to the end of this incredible journey, I hope Sarah's story has inspired you to spread kindness and compassion wherever you go. Remember, even the smallest acts of kindness can change someone's life in ways you can't even imagine. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more real-life tales of hope, transformation, and the power of kindness, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Stories of Hope. That way, you'll never miss out on our future stories that will leave you inspired and motivated. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.